So we're going to cover a couple slides here that we did last Friday, and I'm just going to review that a little bit. We're talking about bacteria here, by the way, and we're talking about how do bacteria reproduce themselves. And the first one that we talked about was binary fission. Now, binary fission, as it says here, is not the normal mitosis way of reproducing. Remember where we have the prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then we have the interphase. This doesn't follow that sequence. What actually happens here is the nuclear material, which remember is not inside of a membrane, will get duplicated, and then the cell will just pinch in two. One side will get half of the nuclear material, the other half will get the other nuclear material, and that is all there's to that process. Okay? So it doesn't have separate phases, where they line up in the middle and all that kind of stuff like that. It just duplicates the material, and it pinches off in the middle and pinches the nuclear material into two bunches, and now we have two cells. So it's not the average normal kind of mitosis. Would somebody close that door, please? Okay, then we also talked about conjugation. Conjugation is a way that it creates genetic variety, but does not involve sperm and egg. Okay? It's not sexual reproduction, but it does provide for genetic variability. So let's say there's two bacteria that are growing together here, and they're near each other, and one of them is going to grow a tube that will extend from one cell to the other cell, and then plasmids will actually surround some of the nuclear material, or all of it, could possibly be, and move it to the other cell. So this may move some of it or all of it. If it moves all of it, this cell's empty, let's say, and that cell obviously will die because it no longer has a control center. But this over here will now have both cells' nuclear material, which probably aren't the same. So that's going to cause variety, variation, genetic differences, or any word you want to. Okay, so that's one of the ways that it's not like they're dividing here and making more. It's a way that they provide or get genetic variation. Then we talked about transformation. That was the last thing I think we talked about. And this is where it says it's a genetic change in a bacteria because a cell from a bacteria, let's say, for some reason died, and it broke open and spilled out its nuclear material. This stuff is floating out in the environment, and it happens to touch one of the bacteria, and that bacteria then pulls that genetic material inside and incorporates it into its own genetic material. So that's going to provide for variety, because it now has some genetic material that didn't come from itself. So that's going to provide, like I said, genetic variation. So we have kind of have two ways that we can get bacteria to vary a little bit from one generation to the next. Now, one thing that I was going to say in this bacteria reproduction, I don't know if you remember reading in the beginning of this section in your book about how fast bacteria can actually reproduce itself. On page 226 in your book, it says, under ideal conditions, many bacteria are able to grow to full size and divide in 30 minutes. So every 30 minutes it's going to be dividing. Well, if you start with one bacteria and you divide after 30 minutes, now you have two. After 30 minutes, each of those will divide, and I'm up to 4. If you kept doing this for 30 generations, in other words, 15 hours, the number of bacteria cells you would have now would be over 1 billion. 30 generations would be over 1 billion. An hour later, the population would be up over 4 billion. So bacteria, if they can multiply that fast, you're going to have a lot of them in a short amount of time. So some bacterial diseases kind of come on you really quickly, and you can see why that's possible that they could come on that quickly. Now, not all bacteria reproduce this fast. It talks about some of them in there that maybe only divide once a day. So they'd be really slow multiplication for those. Now, what do bacteria need to live? Well, some of them are autotrophic. Okay, what's our definition of autotrophic? What's our definition of autotrophic? Okay, Laura?
Self-feeding.
Self-feeding. Okay, and they can do that by photosynthesis. So remember we talked about some blue-green algae that are capable of carrying on photosynthesis that are in this category. So they can use sunlight to make their own food. So they feed themselves. Then you have some are chemosynthetic. What does that mean? This one uses light to make their own food. This one uses what? You'd think that this is the opposite. They often do it in the dark, that's true. Okay, they will use inorganic chemicals, and they'll get the energy from the bonds within them to provide the energy they need to make their own food. Okay, so they're going to get it from the compounds out there, but they're not going to use light. Okay, and often they have to do this because they live in the dark often. Okay, now, but most of them are heterotrophic. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be heterotrophic?
They depend on other things to feed.
Okay, they depend on other living things or other materials. Like they don't always have to be alive, but they live off of other things, whether they're dead or alive. Now, what do we call it if a bacteria lives off of dead animal material? In other words, they were once living and they're now decomposing. What do we call bacteria that live off of decaying plant and animal material? Starts with an S, so I'll give you a hint. And your notes are the great place to look for these answers. And a word that you'll want to learn, yes? Okay, saprophytic, that's exactly the right word. It means to live off of dead, decaying plant or animal matter. Okay, so bacteria that are decomposers, remember we talked about many of the living things on earth have to be decomposed. We don't want everything that's ever once alive laying around yet. That would get to be pretty bad after a while. We want everything broken down so that their raw materials can be used by other living things. In other words, recycling. God made our earth to be really good at it being able to recycle it. The other word is parasitic. So what do you think this means? To be a parasite. Parasitic. Yes?
Feeding on living stuff.
Okay, feeding off of other living things. Okay? So when a bacteria infects us, they're living off of us, and they would be a parasite. Okay? So they live off of other living organisms. Now, some, it says, are obligate parasites. In other words, they have to, they're obligated, think of that word, they have to function as a parasite. They have to live off of others. There's no other way. Some of them might be able to function a couple different ways, but some of them have to get there. There's no, if they can't get it from some other living organism, then they can't grow and they'll probably die. So, what do you need for bacteria to reproduce rapidly? Well, obviously they need to be moist. Okay, there needs to be moisture, water present. What can we do to food to make it, to keep it from spoiling as quickly? Let's say fruit. We often do this with fruit. We dehydrate it, right? How many of you have dehydrators to make your own dried fruit? Anybody? You have one? That's why you know. We dry it, and that will stay in that dried form. It can stay good for long periods of time. Okay? People used to do that a lot more because they didn't have refrigerators. Refrigerators really, something that came about maybe within the last 100 years. People before that maybe could, during the winter months could use ice, to keep things cold, but they didn't have refrigeration as such. So they had to have other means of making their food last during the winter months, and that's one of the ways is drying it. Now, another thing that they need is temperature. What can okay, let's say you are infected by a bacteria, and bacteria happen to like your body temperature. That's its optimum temperature, is your body temperature. What can you do, what does your body do to sometimes slow down their reproduction? That's when you get a fever, right? Okay? A fever, I raise the body temperature, my body temperature, and now it's not in the bacteria's optimal range, and so it doesn't reproduce as fast, giving my body a chance to gain the upper hand and getting well. So that's the reason for a fever. So fevers aren't bad, but fevers aren't good if they're high for long periods of time. That's when you can lead to brain damage and things like that. But a low fever is not bad at all. So sometimes we want to get rid of the fever, but no, that's our body's natural defense against them. Okay, another one is pH. Does anybody know what pH has anything to do with? There's a chart over there that says pH indicator chart. There's actually a couple words on there that might be clue, but they're written in really small letters. What does it have something to do with? That first word. Okay, it has to do with acids. Okay? Bacteria don't, a lot of them don't do well when you put them in an acid environment. Now remember, we did say there were some bacteria that can survive in an acid environment. Remember we talked to those acetophils? They're the ones that can live in an acid environment. So, what do we often do with foods to make them, to keep them from spoiling that involves acids? Okay, we sometimes use lemon. You're kind of on the right trail here. What else?
Vinegar.
We use vinegar. And if we put foods in vinegar, we'll say that we are doing what to them? Starts with a P.
Pickling.
We're pickling them. Okay? So vinegar is used a lot for pickling. Cucumbers, for instance, is one of the things that we often probably, when you think of pickles or pickling, you always think of cucumbers being pickled. But people used to pickle all kinds of stuff. I remember, here's some of the things that I've eaten growing up that were pickled. Green beans, not too bad, actually. Let's see, we had cucumbers. having such a hard time right now thinking about it. Anybody else think of something around the line? Yes?
Carrots.
Oh yeah, carrots was one of the things that pickled carrots. I like those. Some people actually pickle eggs. Yeah, so it's not necessarily for everybody. And I think some of these things, that's the interesting thing about food. Foods are an acquired taste. There's some things that people consider a delicacy, and if you've never eaten it before, you might think it tastes nasty. But one of the things that I remember we would also eat that were actually pretty good was pickled beets. I know most people don't eat beets anymore, but some people do. Or another one was after you'd have a watermelon, you'd have the rind that was left behind. They would cut out the red part and the green and pickle it. So you have pickled watermelon rind.